So we're just wanting to put a spotlight on the Northern Rivers community and see how we're faring after the media has left our region. We're very aware that the floods have rendered, destroyed or rendered uninhabitable about 3,000 houses in our region. And as is the case in many other parts of Australia, we were already suffering a housing crisis up here, which has worsened during the COVID with rent rises of up to 40%. The floods increased our community's housing stress in particular, and we want to explore today some of the realities of this, as well as discussing the structural and policy impediments to adequately supporting people to obtain safe and affordable housing in our region, particularly in the light of the floods. So we'll begin by hearing from our wonderful local expert panel, and then we'll have time for some Q&A hopefully at the end. So if anyone would like to share questions arising as we chat, please put those things in the chat and we'll get to as many of those as we possibly can. So I'm very honoured to introduce our panel, and I wish to publicly thank them again for all their time. I encourage you to read their bios about the incredible work they're doing, which is all available for you on the TASA website if you haven't read that information. But I'll hand over firstly to Brendan Ross, who's the coordinator of the Northern Rivers Tenants Advice and Advocacy Service. Thanks, Brendan.
No worries. Thank you, Josephine. I'm just making sure everyone can hear me okay. Okay, great. So I'm the coordinator of the Northern Rivers Tenants Advice and Advocacy Service. We're part of a statewide network of services, but we're based in Lismore, which is one of the areas that were, devastatingly impacted by the floods. Additionally, our office went under as well. So I think for us, like for the service, we've kind of focused on being responsive and accessible to flood impacted clients as much as possible, even though we were impacted. So I think from our context, we're adaptable and flexible enough to kind of keep providing our service, but the way we've provided our services changed dramatically, and a lot of it's in a good way, but essentially from the outset, we had staff attending the disaster recovery centres, speaking to people face to face, because that's basically what they needed. Coming to terms with what had happened as well, because, we talk a lot to, like pre-flood, we'd talk occasionally about termination for frustration, which is where the tenancy can't continue through no fault of either party, but for example, through a natural disaster. And come to terms with the reality is trying to preserve the tenancy, but make sure it's safe for people to be in. And speaking to clients who are often for the first time in their life had been facing the very real prospect of homelessness. So it's hard to quantify the impact on people. And to be honest, we're still learning, we're moving more into a community development space or working with the community development workers to be out in community to understand what the community need is. Because what I'm finding is it goes through phases, and you don't know until you speak to people in the community as well. This is also something that happened because, as Josephine mentioned, there's about 3,000 houses and a lot of those were tenanted, are just no longer available. So we are giving as practical advice as possible. And often you're giving the advice in the context of people have got, significant financial hardship, or because they've lost all the possessions and have to repurchase them, facing homelessness, being involved in a hyper-competitive rental market. So it was really competitive anyway. Just through the amount and the affordability, which Josephine touched on. So rents, there was a housing crisis already. The people seeking a tenancy was more than what existed, and naturally it pushes up the rental market anyway, which increasingly prices people out of, or means there's less availability, or for people who are already struggling financially, completely prices them out. And that's sad. I don't want to sound too grim, but that's obviously gotten a lot worse since the floods. So it's when we speak to people, the nature of how we run our service and the way we kind of support people and the way we're trying to collaborate with other services has changed, and by necessity, but also it's, we're learning that's collaborative planning and working with other services is better anyway, which we always aspire to do. It was kind of timely. We had a meeting this morning with a homelessness service in the area, Connecting Home, and talking about the crossover, because essentially we're not, we give advice. Often it's preserving tenancies is one of our main priorities at the moment, and also develop trying to identify broader issues and healthy referral pathways, and talking about potential remedies if they've kind of had been like suffered some kind of wrongdoing or disadvantage by the landlord or park operator or something like that. But I think it's more of like thinking about how coming to terms with I'll be frank, like the crushing reality of how homelessness impacts people, because we're more acutely aware of it, because a lot of our clients are either actually experiencing it or the threat of it, which is causes a huge again, it's hard to quantify, but it causes a huge impact on how people feel about themselves, how they navigate their lives, how they deal with matters where usually they'd be quite comfortable, but they're dealing with this perpetual stress of not having a secure home, which is what people should have anyway, and it's what people struggle to have anyway. But it's gotten increasingly harder. The other thing I just wanted to talk about, because we're based in Lismore, and I'll be honest, like absolutely, like we are lucky enough to work with the TU, who do some fantastic advocacy and just a wealth of information, and us argue for law reform and policy change and stuff like that. At the moment, I'll be honest, like we're kind of stuck in the immediate aftermath and just focusing on using our resources to provide a service to clients as much as we can and as most appropriately as we can, because we find people are kind of asking different questions now. We're kind of moving away from just giving substantive advice and advocacy. We still do that, but understanding the broader impacts of what they're going through and where it kind of goes outside of what we do, developing really healthy relationships with other services to share helpful information, but also guide that referral process, because we've got to be realistic about what we can do. But yeah, I think I'll be honest, there's a lot I could say. I don't want to kind of ramble on too much, but I think for us, what I've found is the impact on people is kind of immeasurable. We're finding out new things every week about what's going on for people in communities. Like we're also by a community legal centre who've developed a disaster recovery team. Part of what they're doing is basically getting a bus where we can travel to pockets of areas where we know people have been significantly impacted, linking up with community groups there, but also it goes two ways, providing a service, but also understand what actually is happening, because we cover quite a big area. And we know there's people out there that kind of would likely benefit from advice or assistance from multiple services that may not have access to it. And I can talk about plenty of examples of how that plays out, but I think for us, the community focus is key. The other thing is all TAS services, I think tenants advice services do, community outreach, community legal education. Our service is kind of modelled, do that where we can, but since the floods, we've been in disaster recovery centres as much as we can. We have been out and about, and we're like, well, actually we do have the resources and the wherewithal and the capacity to do it. So we're going to continue that model moving forward, because one thing's key is people need to speak to someone face-to-face as well. And you need to think a bit more wraparound. So, you don't want someone to go to one place and then call another and then call another. You want to set up something where they're like, we can answer this for you and we can help you with this. But we're fully aware that, what you're experiencing can at times be complex or compounded. And this is the best and easiest way for you to, get help elsewhere. I just want to take pause because I feel like I'm rambling a bit because there's a lot to say. But Josephine, can I just check in? Is there anything you want me to focus on at the moment?
I guess one of the things that I'm thinking about as you're talking, I'm thinking about a friend telling me recently, and I guess this is just to communicate it to the broader population that are attending, that there are still some communities that are cut off in the Northern Rivers.
Yeah.
That actually have roads cut off and little footbridges across to, and food drops have only recently stopped in some areas. So, part of this conversation really arose out of a conversation with Sally and I about how the Australian public who felt they knew Lismore earlier this year really feel like everything's Rosie now in Lismore. Do you know what I mean? So we
Yeah,
were
yeah,
just wanting to bring to people's attention just
yep.
how devastating this has been. As you said, it's
Mm.
impossible to articulate.
Yeah,
And
no,
I
thank you
think,
for that. Yeah,
yeah,
yeah, absolutely. So Lismore's kind of set in, it's about 30 or 40 minutes inland. So if everyone generally knows where Byron is, so it's southwest of that, but it's about a 40-minute drive. But Lismore's like this, it's technically a city. I love it. It's my home. It's quirky and weird and got all sorts of beautiful stuff about it, but it's kind of located, I mean, I'm not a geologist or land, like, it's got a rainforest, big rain, like Nightcap, just north west of us. There's lots of little communities dotted about. Some of them are accessible by, small roads that are maintained occasionally, but, but they're small communities, so they don't really get a lot of attention. People love living there because they're kind of, a lot of people are off the grid, and they've got like a self-sustaining kind of mentality as well. But yeah, I know of one that was cut off for months afterwards, and we were speaking to clients saying, well, I can walk in, but I need to park my car, walk 500 metres through two people's properties. I need to get their consent, and I run my business from home, which I can't run anymore, and I don't know what to do because even though technically I can still live where I'm living, they're still significantly impacted, from their life. And I think I'm not a psychologist, but the broader impact of being cut off, like actually cut off from the rest of the community, is quite devastating for people. I'll be honest, we're still learning about things like that, or little areas that basically no one's, like Cabbage Tree Island, as well, with a large Aboriginal community. A lot of people had to, like, that's their home, but they've had to kind of move because the houses aren't habitable and they just don't know when it's going to come back. But to live there is really, really important. And it's like, well, of course we can talk about tenancy issues, but there's much, much more things that need to be happening in that regard. And I've kind of learned a lot about disaster response. It's not something that just changes. I mean, I think people are doing their best, but the relief and the support that's available, like whatever happens, it needs to be sustained. Like, thinking 5 years to a decade before the whole community comes back. I can speak to Lismore. Like, we're actually back I've got a temporary office in the CBD. We felt like it's important to be in the community, even though it's temporary, it's not signposted or anything like that. We do face-to-face when we can and all that kind of stuff, but it's important to be here and actually know what's going on the ground. And describing Lismore, like, things are popping up and it gives people optimism. But if you're looking at it overall, you're still looking at, like, I drove through South and North Lismore the other day, and there's, yeah, just not destroyed, there's structurally they're still there, but, lights are off, no furniture, just still covered in mud, type thing. And I mean, I don't want to sound too emotional, but you're like, well, that was someone's home not that long ago, that all of a sudden it's just not anymore. So, so yeah, thank you for raising that, because I think, being a bit of a local, I do think of Lismore as a broader area, and we're still learning. I mean, from a service point of view, it's like, you don't know what's going on in the community until you're there, and you've had an opportunity to listen to people as well on their own terms, because it'd be remiss of us to know exactly what's going on for everyone. And that's kind of what we're aspiring to do, is to kind of be out and about as much as possible and adapt our service to give practical advice and assistance, but also have a bit more of a pragmatic and flexible approach with how we do that, which is by necessity, but also I think there's, that's what we're going to model our service on moving forward anyway, because there's a lot of value in that, and, connecting with other services and talking to, being out in community more and talking to tenants more, or community groups and all that stuff. It's just, it's amazing how big your capacity feels like it grows when you do that. And just for context as well, I was fairly new to the coordinator position before the flood. So yeah, it's something where I'm, I'll be honest, I'm still learning the role. I've got really good support, feel totally comfortable with that thing. But I think, collaborative planning and that kind of stuff is key. So, and also being in the community space as much as you can. I think it's essential anyway, but especially now, like, people have clearly identified that they need to speak to someone face to face. Phone calls are helpful, but they need to sit down and explain in their own terms what they're going through to feel comfortable enough to kind of take on the advice in a meaningful way, or so you feel like they feel like you kind of understand their matter well enough to kind of talk appropriately about, you know, the next steps and all that kind of stuff. The other thing
oh, sorry. I was just going to say, it's so helpful that you raise that, Brendan, because you really give people a sense of this is something in process. This isn't something that has happened in the past. This is something in process, and thinking about a 5 to 10 year time frame of getting communities back on track is, you know, really gives, again, that really clear idea about what we're really up against here. Thank you so much. I'll need to move on to...
Yeah, of course,
to Simone now. I know she's been involved closely with your work as well. Simone Hickey is a Senior Financial Counsellor from the Lismore District Financial Counselling Service. Simone?
Hi everyone. Thanks for organising this today, Josephine. It's wonderful to have us all together. So just to let you know, our region that we look after, it's quite a vast region. So it's from Evans Head across to Casino. Our head office has been in Lismore for many, many years. Ballina, Mullumbimby, Murwillumbah and Tweed, where we have all our outreach locations. So also our office was in Molesworth Street. Yes, there was nothing left in the office. Myself personally, within our service, we had 2 staff members that lost their homes and were significantly impacted by the floods. Myself, to be completely honest, I actually had to get some counselling around it. I had some survivor's guilt because I don't actually live in the region, and I felt at times it's just our office and was trying to have compassion for other people, but it really did affect our whole team. We were fortunate enough in a joint partnership that Lifeline supplied some caravans, and we had financial counsellors placed at the evacuation centre at Griffith University, which was very worthwhile. We were very grateful for the caravans to work out of. Perhaps I probably could talk a little bit about other locations, Mullumbimby and Murwillumbah. So those areas have just been devastated. We have a financial counsellor that works in Mullumbimby currently, and also, has been heavily involved there. The office in Murwillumbah is been completely gone as well. That was out of the community centre. And we were lucky enough, there's the Coolum Centre, which wasn't affected. So we have a financial counsellor working out of there. We've had some wonderful news through Financial Counselling Australia that we now have funding to employ another 4 financial counsellors in the area. So specifically to work with flood recovery. So we'll be really happy to take on any referrals. We're there to support the community. The roles will be a little bit different to previously financial counselling roles. So we'll be able to assist with small business and long-term, over a 2-year period, case support, assisting a lot with insurance claims and making referrals and working side by side with legal aid. I think that's about all that we're doing at the moment.
Thanks, Simone. That sounds fantastic. I'm so pleased to hear that you've got more people coming on board as well. That's absolutely brilliant. So the next person we're going to hear from is John Lee, who is very well known in our region as the founder and CEO of You Have a Friend, a service for the homeless. And I first heard John speak at my children's school, and he was absolutely inspiring, and the children still talk about his talk at that time. So John, I'd like to hand over to you to let us know what you're seeing there.
Thanks very much, Josephine, and everybody. It's great to be here, and thank you for putting this on, Josephine. It's great. Yeah, just a very quick background. I mean, I'm sure you don't want to hear too much about me, but I've been working on the streets, started on my own for 22 years now, all around the Tweed area. then I registered my charity in 2008. It's called You Have a Friend. None of us in my charity are paid. I've got 80 volunteers. We do, basically we don't work from an office, we work out in the streets. So we do breakfasts, and COVID of course destroyed us. We do a lot of breakfasts, go out as far as Yukai, Mount Warning, Mowbray, Chindera, Pottsville, and also Tweed Heads a lot, and Coolangatta. So basically we're a Tweed Heads a community, a Tweed Heads organisation, and before the floods, we were doing over 300 meals a week on the street. Slowly getting back up to that now. Started again about 4 weeks ago. Started doing breakfast for the boys on a Sunday, and yeah, so that's how we operate. That's how we like to operate. And as I said, I've got a wonderful team of people, probably because none of us get paid, so they're there for the cause. With regards to floods, I spent a lot of time trying to help people in Chindera, Lismore as well. We went down to Lismore. We were doing some work down there, trying to help them, and also we've done during the drought. We were down at Stanthorpe, helping people down there. Organised, got some very good funding, so we were able to team up with a lot of the farmers and provide them with a invention that my wife actually came up with, whereby we linked two 23,000 litre tanks together with polypiping, and eventually linked it into the dam, where once the dam's filled up again, the farmers can pump it to all areas of their farm. So we did a lot of that. Done a lot of work within the floods. I've done in 2011, 2017, and now again 2022. The thing that really probably upsets me the most is the lack of support from Tweed Shire Council. I don't mind saying it. Tweed Shire Council, lack of support. I see that in the Tweed Valley Weekly recently, one of the councillors is saying, well, we've got these pods, where are they? We've got people. We were helping old people at Chindera, for example, standing there just looking at, just standing and looking and saying, we were going to retire here, people over 80 years old, we were going to retire here, we've got nothing now, what's happened, we're gone. And other old fellas, two old fellas sitting in a caravan, just having a beer and saying, why carry on? And that was in February. Well, as Councillor Dennis has said in the Tweed Valley Weekly, I mean, that's months ago. What's happened? I see the Tweed Shire Mayor has actually said that there were 2,100 homes destroyed during the floods. 500 of them are uninhabitable. Now, 500 homes, where are those people doing? I know, I see them on the streets now. And 500 people or homes totally destroyed. And the Tweed Shire Council has said, all right, we're putting the pods up. 39 pods, which will look after about 50 people, and we've got 500 homes damaged. What is going on? Just this last Sunday, a young lady, probably in her early 40s, came to me for our breakfast. She joined us at breakfast at 8 o'clock. And I got talking to her. She and her son, who's in year 11, still at school, sleep under bridges, sleep in under houses, and they've got nothing yet has been done. We're trying to help them now, but where is the house? And they're talking about the pods. There aren't any pods. There aren't any pods here. Well, when 39, we're going to put 39 up in Kingscliff. I mean, come on. So sorry, I'm getting a little bit cranky, but that's how it is. And you know, I've experienced a lot of. We had a farmer who was prepared to give us 55 acres of land, and we were going to put up houses in that. We had a big meeting with the Tweed Shire Council. and until they said to us, oh, now you're going to have to spend about $2 million putting up electricity, sewerage and all. That's fine. But every step we've gone, we've been blocked. So, you know, I don't mind talking about this. They all know. I'm talking about the Tweedshire Council. They all know that I say that, you know, that I'm saying, well, what are you doing? I wouldn't put it out now, but I can give you some comments that I've heard from councillors and I've heard from the Tweedshire, which would make your hair curl, about homeless people. And that's who we deal with. We deal with homeless people, and we're watching it. And as a number of you people have spoken, yeah, they are on the streets. They are on the streets, old ladies, old men, and we're going to do 39 pods. Hello. So, yeah, I'll try and come down off my horse.
No, John, I think there's been very valid criticisms put forward, and I, you know, especially about the pods which have been promised, and I also know of people, particularly a lot of single mothers, who are living in cars with children going to school every day, and it's just beyond, it's so distressing, like how they are managing to function and look after their children and get the children to school, let alone
it is
capacity at school.
And that's the whole thing. I know of mothers which we try and get into houses, but they're saying, oh, there's no houses. Well, anyhow, I do know that there are mothers out there who are hiding in their cars because they're scared docs will take the children away. So, you know, there's a problem. There's a problem here. And when you get 39 pods for 500 houses that have been condemned, something's wrong.
Yes.
And nothing's been done.
Yes.
So, yeah, thanks for your time.
I really appreciate your voice in this conversation, John, really.
Okay.
Thank you so much.
Pleasure.
It is very distressing to hear all of this because we are living in it. And yes, I know plenty of affected people as well, or people that are still expected to pay rent with properties that are covered in mould, where you can't actually get rid of that mould, and that are making the families ill. Especially single mothers is obviously who I'm hearing about as a mum with kids myself. So Jean Renouf, we are going to hear from next. He is the founder and chair of Resilient Byron, and he's also an academic at Southern Cross University, which is the local university that set up a rescue evacuation centre and did a fantastic job as well. So
yes,
John.
hello. Thank you. It's been a pleasure already listening to all of you. Maybe a quick word about Resilient Byron. So it's a non-for-profit charity which we founded 3 years ago, prior to the bushfires and COVID, once upon a time when Australia was still seen as a lucky country. And precisely in anticipation of such kind of massive compounding disasters and crises, which we knew would be so disruptive to our ways of life. So our purpose has been and remains to, one, connect people with each other, with themselves and the natural environment, to build the resilience to disasters and everything from prevention, mitigation to response and recovery. And finally, to regenerate our systems, because, you know, let's face it, the reason why we are in such troubles at the moment is because we have had, we've chosen ways that are destructive of our, you know, communities, of our natural environments, and therefore if we want to be effectively resilient to the climate crisis, we need to rethink our food system, our water systems, our energy systems, our communication system, education system, health system, etc., with the long-term future generations perspective. So that's what we focus on. We have started in Byronshire, but now effectively our footprint is the 6 northern LGAs of the Northern Rivers, including Tweed, Lismore, but also Richmond Valley, Ballina, and Byronshire, Kyogle also. And we have been, during the floods, we've mostly worked in the Byronshire. We're based in the Mullumbimby, and expanded. We supported a lot, including those isolated communities. And you're right, some communities up in the hills, whose only access in and out of the valley has been destroyed by landslides, are still being isolated, and their way out is still just by foot. So we've been supporting these, especially the few weeks and months following the floods. And now we are in a kind of process of we're aiming to to harness, the experience of the flood and the recovery process that goes with it to build community resilience. So a major project we're involved with at the moment, which looks including at housing, but from a resilience perspective. And nowadays there are still thousands of people homeless and vulnerable to housing insecurity, and there are thousands more who are vulnerable to future disasters because their house is not resilient, to bushfires, floods, storms, name it. So there are wider perspectives at play here. There's also a massive amount of mental health issues, and I would say that for those of you who don't live in the Northern Rivers, there are definitely people who have been directly affected by the floods, whether because they had water in their properties or landslides, but also, like, I would argue the whole of the Northern Rivers has been indirectly affected, because when you wake up one morning and you've lost your access to power, to communications, to water, to food, to schools, to health, to roads, it is a severely disempowering, disruptive moment in your life, and that shocks the foundation of what you consider to be your normal life. So a lot of people have been deeply traumatized by this, and had no access to cash and petrol and food, from one day to the next. So what we're working on is trying to bring all of this together, and at the moment we are establishing a network of local residents, which we call the Northern Rivers Community Carers and Responders Network, whereby we train, equip, and connect these individuals. We train them in community building, disaster resilience, and regeneration, in first aid and psychological first aid. So they undertake 5 days of training across 6 months. As part of this, there's an added element whereby we also look at mentoring. We mentor them so that each of these community carers and responders, CCR, is asked to lead or engage a community resilience building project in their own community. And we mentor them in the implementation of this project, but also we cross-fertilize knowledge among the different community members. Like some of the CCR, come in with a wealth of experience in, food security and community garden, or building social cohesion and organizing community events and stuff like that. So we harness this knowledge and we ask those to mentor other CCR who are interested in implementing this sort of projects so that they can learn from that. We're also looking, it's just a small pilot project at food security. I'm not going to talk too much about it right now because it's not the focus of today's conversation, but I think it's something that needs to be kept in mind. So ultimately, what I see happening is there's a really depth of need for people to be heard, regardless of what was their experience in the floods, still now. And there's a semblance of life going back to normal. If you look, at the window, you'll see mostly people going to work, to school and stuff like that. But as Brendan has mentioned, lots of shops remain closed. As John has mentioned, lots of people are homeless and do not receive the help that they're supposed to, but it's quite hidden. So you don't necessarily see it. So there's semblance of life going back to normal without really appreciating the depth of the trauma that the region has gone through the first and then the second floods 4 weeks later. So we're trying to support basically this, and through connection, organizing different events among those community members. And we do see that people are able to they feel empowered in a recovery when they feel heard, they have a sense of where they can get support, that they need more support, they receive, they're connected to others, like-minded people who want to move towards building a safer region, basically, more resilient to future disasters. So I'm feeling, positive within those community members as to, actually, we're doing it, and the community response, the flood was extraordinary, throughout the Northern Rivers. Community hubs popped up everywhere. People started helping each other everywhere, opened the houses everywhere, shared food. And I think the spirit is still very pregnant around, but people are exhausted. So there's a deep sense of exhaustion and tiredness, and therefore the social connection and mental health support, both services but also outreach, is necessary. And to finish with, I'd like to, we don't have the funding for that, but I would like us to be able to provide some precisely trauma-informed based community events in the communities, acknowledging most people who suffer from mental health issues don't necessarily ask for the help. And if you look at the research that was done after 2017 floods in Lismore, there was a spike of requests for help 7 months after the floods.
Mm.
So we should expect, now we are approaching the 6-month mark, which will be a trigger for many. The rains are coming back, which will be a trigger for many. So we need to have this ongoing trauma-informed community-based support happening from different services, but also, you know, by the community to the community, as John has shown before.
Thank you so much, John. That is a fantastic thing to raise, because I think you're right that the you know, the reaction to the trauma and the height of the distress is often quite some time after the crisis has occurred, which is partly why we're meeting here today.
Yeah.
Yeah, so it's really important thing to raise. And of course, then if people feel reluctant to share that they're in crisis because allegedly the crisis happened months ago.
Exactly.
And I certainly know among young people that I'm very connected to, I am hearing trauma all the time, and just a sense of absolute hopelessness about the future after fires, pandemic, floods. And I think they sense the wobbliness of the adults around them. So yeah, I really appreciate you sharing about your work. It just sounds wonderful.
Pleasure. Thank you.
And I would like to also say the most amazing thing about this community is it always is such a warm and giving place. I went through the floods quite intensively in 2017. And we were cut off, and, you know, everybody just opened homes, shared food. You know, everybody was constantly moving around to make sure that everybody was fully, you know, had food, were warm, they were dry, everyone was caring for everybody else. So the resilience of these communities, the care is extraordinary. It's absolutely beautiful. And when you describe it to other people, they sort of think you're talking about an imagined space, but it is. The community spirit up here is absolutely remarkable, I think, and very unique. So we're now on to our last speaker, who's Jemima Mowbray. She's the Head of Policy and Advocacy for the Tenants Union of New South Wales. And I thought she may be able to give us that broader overarching thing that I guess a lot of the speakers have raised, these structural issues that are, and policy issues that are impeding solutions at the moment. Thanks, Jemima.
Hi, everyone. So firstly, I'd like to acknowledge the really amazing work and the trauma that you have been through yourselves, and then also you've been supporting a whole lot of people in the community, and a lot of you are doing that really directly. So thank you for sharing what you're seeing and the pressures that you're feeling. I really appreciate that. So yes, I'm Jemima. I'm from the Tenants Union of New South Wales, and Brendan very nicely referred to us a little bit earlier. We often fall back, and I'll probably call myself the TU at some point, but we're the Tenants Union of New South Wales. We are a peak body, and we represent the interests of renters across New South Wales. So that's the 1 in 3 people who rent their home in New South Wales. But really importantly, and probably our key work, is we resource the network of tenants advice services. So Northern Rivers Tenants Advice Service, we are part of a network with them, and we support the work or try and resource centres or services like Brendan. So we are here we do training, we do policy work, and we do legal backup. So kind of connecting in with advocates to make sure that we're giving them advice if they need advice, or supporting them. And I think in relation to what's been happening with the floods recently, the Tenants Union has also, I suppose, been trying to connect with Brendan and say, what do you need? How can we help potentially triage and connect to all of the other tenants advice services across the state have also stepped in to say, how can we help to make sure that when renters call in, and it might be renters in the Northern Rivers who are impacted by the floods directly, but it might just be renters who also just are always needing tenancy advice and still need to be getting that support. But it's been really tricky at the at the moment with the pressures on Northern River Tas. So I suppose that's the role that we have been playing. But yeah, I'm going to be a little bit different in kind of what I'm talking to, in that I'll take a little bit of a step back. And I think a lot of what I'll be talking about, just to give you a picture of what housing and the pressures around housing has looked like in Lismore post floods, I'll take a step back and look at what it looked like prior to the floods as well. And I think it's going to be a pretty familiar story to you because it's a story that we see across Australia. It's a story that we see across New South Wales, and it's something that we've been talking about as a community for a while, the housing crisis that we've all been facing. But I think in regional areas at the moment, there's a particular kind of pressure that is being felt. And when you see these kind of natural crisis events or natural weather crisis events, that just compounds that really hard situation that a lot of households have already been in. You know, what and just, I think most people would know this too now, and I mentioned it a little bit earlier, but you know, I'm talking about housing, but in a lot of ways, but I will be focusing on renters, and I want to talk about housing justice really, or how do we deal with this housing crisis, or what does it look like when you have floods, and what does that mean in terms of this housing crisis? It is worth thinking or highlighting how much renters are just as much a part of our housing and homelessness system. I think sometimes when we talk about housing, or certainly at a policy level, we can often focus on ownership. But yeah, it's in terms of who's renting, you know, 1 in 3 of us rent. The main household type of people who are renting, they're actually families with kids. We have an increasing number of older people who are renting. We have an increasing number of people, young people who are going into share housing situations because of the pressures around affordability, and the number of people who are renting is continuing to increase. So we were already around a third, of just below a third at the 2016 census. We've just seen new data released from census, and it's clear in New South Wales we're 1 in 3, and in some areas it's much higher than that in terms of people who are renting. And we're also really long-term renters, you know, sometimes, or I think most people understand this now. People used to think about it as this really transitional phase, but it's certainly not transitional. It's for a lot of us, long-term renting is, you know, we might be renting for our lives, but at least 1 in 3 of us who rent has been renting for at least 10 years. So in Lismore prior to the floods, and I think across the state of New South Wales, we know that there was a housing crisis. You know, there was very little affordable housing, but I think what we sometimes don't talk about, we talk about the affordability. I think there was also what gets missed too is there's something of an eviction crisis. We see actually quite a lot of people being forced to move, and that might be because of the affordability question. You know, we can't afford to stay where we are, and we might not get the eviction notice, but essentially we're forced to leave just because we're being priced out. But we were also actually seeing landlords using eviction at quite a high rate, and that might be so they could sell homes. It might just be because there's so little power for renters at the moment. You kick up a fuss, they don't like you, they think they can get more, and you can be evicted, and you might not have breached a contract, but in New South Wales you can still be evicted for no grounds or no reason. So we were seeing renters forced to move a whole lot, which actually has a really significant financial impact on people. You know, we've done sort of estimates around this, and we calculated costs around $4,000 every time a household is forced to leave. And so you can imagine that too now in Lismore. We were seeing people being forced to leave quite a lot at a higher, at an increasing rate across the regions prior to the floods. And I think the floods also just created a situation where people are having to find new housing, and there are always lots of costs involved with that, relocating and rebuilding your life, alongside all of the other financial pressures that came up because of the floods. So just in terms of the market, most people will know, you know, there's been post-COVID, there's been a really hard impact across the regions in New South Wales. We've seen the tightest vacancy rates on record across all of regional New South Wales. In Lismore, that looks like, prior to the floods and certainly now, that looks like under 0.5% vacancy rate. There's really just no properties available. And that has a flow-on impact through into rents. And so people would have noticed that rents have been going up across the regions. In Lismore, the median rent at the moment is around $600. So that's a comparable median rent. It's maybe even a little bit higher than in Sydney. And the incomes in the area, though, are $500 less than the median income in the area, $500 less than Sydney. So you can kind of imagine the pressures for low-income households in the area immediately. So already prior to the floods, we were hearing from Brendan and colleagues and colleagues across the community sector just about this, I suppose, the trauma they were feeling and the fatigue they were feeling because they were seeing people coming in the door week on week who they didn't know how to help because there are no resources to help them. There's just no avenues to help them find alternative accommodation. In the regions prior to post-COVID and prior to these floods, we were already seeing, and up in Lismore, I think this was the case, Brendan, you can speak to it directly, but certainly across all the regional tenants advice services, we were seeing an increase in the number of advices that we were giving around no grounds eviction. So there's evictions where there's no fault, there's no breach on the part of the tenant, but the landlord is moving them on, and sale, notice of termination for sale. And what we think that was about is that with that really tight vacancy in the area, partly because of post-COVID, pressures with people moving into the regions, landlords were moving people on to take advantage of the increased rent, or they could see a really strong property market. And this is the impact of thinking about homes as investments, as properties, not as homes for people, as this essential service that people are giving. They would go, oh, wait a second, I'm going to take it out of the rental market. I'm going to shift on that household, that family, and I'm going to sell it because the market's really strong at the moment. So that, obviously was having a huge impact for renters in the area and in terms of that housing. So, one story I heard at the time was that specialist homelessness services with no emergency accommodation available, no transitional accommodation available to them, were actually literally giving out tents to people because there were no other options. And that to me is just a devastating kind of reflection that our government funding services, there's nothing for them to give anybody except a tent. But I don't think that's going to come as a surprise to anybody who's on the panel here. To me, I think it's just going to ring true. And that's prior to floods when we saw 4,000 homes disappear. In terms of social housing, it's a similar picture up in Lismore as it is to everywhere else in the state. You're looking at 5 to 10 year waits once you are eligible. We know not everybody who needs social housing will actually meet the eligibility criteria at the moment. You can be in rental stress and not be eligible, but even if you're even at eligibility, once you've ticked all the boxes, you're still waiting 5 to 10 years. Because of the floods, I talking to a community housing provider recently, they had 150 of their homes, so people who are already in social housing, 150 of their homes were impacted, and half of those are uninhabitable. Impacted to the point where they're now having to find alternative accommodation for those tenants. And so we've got a waiting list, we've got people in the homes, and now the impact of the floods is you can imagine. So I think one of the things that you mentioned, Josephine, were some of just the direct impacts that the floods have had for people who are renting. And I think these are already problems that we see all the time, but they've just been, I used the word compounded before, but compounded because of the pressures of the floods. So things like mold, which, we're in Sydney, it's very wet, everybody's experiencing mold, but I think the repairs that the damage that was done by the floods are now, a few months on, the mold that is coming up now, these are things that are really not safe to be living with. and for a range of reasons, probably a range of other things that need to be fixed because of safety reasons, basic urgent repairs, but it's really hard. A lot of renters are feeling like they can't actually chase those up because where are they going to go? And also that power dynamic that was already at play and that's at play for other renters across the state, even more so. You know, if I make a fuss, will I lose my housing? And then where on earth do I go? And I think, so I know I've gone a little bit over time, and it would be great to have some discussion. So I think just some last thoughts. It's worth mentioning, you know, the lowest, the people on the lowest income are probably the hardest hit in terms of their housing and the impact that's been felt. So a lot of the flood prone zone is where you would have found the more affordable homes that people were renting. And so they have seen the most significant damage. And so, you know, they were probably already in a range of, you know, facing financial difficulties. That's now being felt even more strongly. And I think it also sort of looking to the medium and longer term future, thinking about what it will mean when those houses that may have been in the lower end of the market now come back onto the market. There are insurance costs that will be, you know, having to be brought in to play, and, you know, even rebuild costs that you know, you're going to have to build at a higher standard to meet some of the, you know, to make them more safe and more adequate and more resilient for events like this. But what it might mean is that people who had been holding on to them and renting them out into the lower end of the market will now not see that as a feasible thing to do if it's a business prospect for them, or if it's, you know, it's an investment. And so they'll be selling on, and for a range of reasons, those properties are going to be taken out of a lower end market. And so I think the problems that we are seeing are only going to be exacerbated. And so we really need to be thinking about new solutions, new ways of looking at this, or taking some old ways that just haven't been put on the table and taking them seriously, and thinking about how we invest in housing that is genuinely affordable for people, how governments do that. So, and the very last thing, just I think people have mentioned the importance of community, and that community stepped in a lot of ways. Our different levels of government might have failed or were very slow, or were slow for a range of reasons in responding, and community stepped in and has been key in kind of supporting each other. And I think that's absolutely true, but it's worth sort of reflecting on, you know, there's a inequitable distribution of income, and that has an impact. You know, if you're lower income, we know that you were harder hit, especially in relation to housing, but also there is sort of there can be an unequal distribution of social capital, you know, who's engaged, who's connected in. And if you have a range, if you've been in crisis prior to the floods, you know, you were finding it hard to connect with people, you were isolated. When something like this kicks in, you may not have the same kind of networks to get the support. The community might want to support you, but you haven't got the entry points or the pathways in. And so it's worth kind of reflecting on the inequity in terms of that social capital that people can hold on to and kind of use as an anchor to moving through and coming out the other end. So yeah, sorry, lots packed in there, but thank you for starting this really interesting conversation.
Thank you so much, Jemima. That's just terrific to get that broader perspective and that reminder that people really were in, you know, the statistics prove that people were in complete crisis, and this has only exacerbated things for the most marginal. I certainly know of lots of people living in cars, tents and caravans. This is just our normal up here now, as I say. So I guess that's really what I wanted the whole of Australia to hear about through running this Taza Thursday. Nita had a question to the panel. As non-locals and distance from the on-the-ground realities, how can we help? What can be done to help support and advocate from a distance? Whoever would like to take that question. John?
Yeah, thank you. It's really interesting and caring question. Thank you for asking. I would say perhaps in multiple ways. First is, I'm sure that also, if we're looking just at housing insecurity and mental health associated with it, I'm sure there are issues all around the country. So if you'd like to get involved personally, I think just look around where you are. I'm pretty convinced you'll find some ways to help locally. If you'd like to help us here, I think advocacy and lobbying, would be helpful. Participating to advocacy and lobbying efforts, and also donating to community organization and get doing the work. So yeah, this is what comes to mind.
Thank you. John, did you have anything that you wanted to add? Just as someone on the ground, you've turned your microphone off. We can't hear you. You've got your microphone off.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Sorry about that. I said, how much time do I have? I didn't know it was off. No, not really. But as I said, the struggle for me is I don't see a way out when we've got so many people waiting. And I know that the panel, and I've heard from a lot of you before, when we've tried to say we've got a woman sleeping in a car, or how can we help, or they come into my op shop and just ask for some food or some help. It's so sad. And when we were all pretty excited when we thought that there were going to be pods here in Kingscliff, to find out that they were supposed to be started in June and finished in 35 days, well, there's just basically one or two sticking up in the air. And then the hardest bit is, and that's not only here, it's all over, they're saying that these pods, 800 the government is talking about, stretched around the country, around the Northern Rivers. And at the end of 2 years, they're getting rid of them. Well, what are they going to do with them? You just say, well, I can't believe this. So there's just no further foresight into, let's try and see if we can give that to the homeless. Because the comments I've heard is, we don't want homeless ghettos popping up. Well, that doesn't have to happen. So yeah, those are the things that really hurt me, especially when you have to send somebody out and say, I can't help you, as you're all indicating, and you've all been there, done that. It's very, very hard and very, very sad to say, I can just give you some clothes, some food, but you're sleeping in your car or under the bridge again tonight. So yeah, that's it. That's
the reality, isn't it? Thank you. Yes,
Perhaps
Sean?
to shed some perspective, I think from a governmental perspective, what I've been attending some, we've been attending some high-level stakeholder meetings on the reconstruction here and recovery and reconstruction. And what someone from Resilience New South Wales, who is behind the pods, was explaining is that I mean, they are acutely aware of the different challenges that they face and the limitations and shortcomings. As we know from the parliamentary inquiry, New South Wales parliamentary inquiry, which was just released a couple of days ago, and the agency itself has been struggling in the response and recovery for all sorts of good and bad reasons. But in addition to these kind of inner institutional challenges, what they have faced is challenges also in terms of identifying right locations for those pods, bringing them and accelerating all the different legal process, any construction, any establishment of any building, it has to go through. So lots of hurdles that they've shortened, but still not quick enough. So they said, no, they're able to go through the process in 6 months. That's already too long, but it would take 2 years without this accelerating of process. But then also, and coming back to the community here, the challenges of community, because a number of those locations have been challenged by local councils and communities, as NIMBY, not in my backyard. Yeah, I want people to have a place to live, but I'd rather not them use my sports field or whatever track, in my neighborhood. So I think that there are some collective social issues here, not just governmental. even though if I agree with John, like the lack of foresight is pretty staggering, really. But something I think we need to reflect on ourselves too, as members of the community. It is a shared responsibility.
Yes, thank you. Yes, sorry, Jemima.
And so this is I think this is a big picture solution, but I think it has an impact across across the board and for communities who are impacted. I know Lismore at the moment is impacted, but we know, you know, the bushfires, end of 2019, beginning of 2020 had a similar impact for across the mountains and the south coast. You know, we saw a lot of the same pressures and the trauma being experienced by those communities that's now being felt up in Lismore. So people might have noticed in the chat, I've dropped a couple of links. The first one that the second thing that I put in there is the first one that I'd speak to, and that's just that, you know, in terms of the housing, we've already had this dire need for public and community housing. We've seen a decrease in the amount of government subsidised housing over the last 20 years that's available for people, despite a really significant increase in the number of people who are needing social housing. So it's public and community housing. So I think, and somebody else has asked a question, I'm sure you're going to get to it, just around the Northern Rivers Reconstruction Corporation as a way to move things forward. I think I don't have a lot to say about that, except that I think what needs to be part of that is the resourcing and the investment that is required. It can't just be how do we make sure that what we have right now can best sort of deliver on more housing and get new homes built as fast as possible. It's clear that there is going to be additional investment required from governments, additional resourcing required to ensure that government subsidised housing is actually rebuilt in the area, and that there are additional subsidies for not just those who would normally be eligible for social housing, but others who are having to rebuild homes to build their homes. I'm not sure that that's outside of the picture, but it's worth thinking through how hard it's been and the challenge that is still there to convince our governments that investing in essential infrastructure like social housing is really important. And so that's the link that I shared in the second part of that chat, is just to a national campaign called Everybody's Home that we're a part of. And we also, in our own campaign, Make Renting Fair, at the New South Wales level, advocate around we need much more significant investment from Commonwealth and state governments together. Really, it's their job to be investing in delivering public and community housing, because we know this housing crisis, this is one intervention that could really help. And it doesn't just house those people who actually need the housing, it does that and it provides an affordable home for them, but it also has this flow-on impact. If you do it at scale, at the scale that we need, it has a flow-on impact into that lower end of the market, so that it takes the pressure off, and you might see some lower rents, but also you're not competing for the same lower, more affordable properties. But also maybe we'd see an increase in the standard that would have to be had, so the house is actually in better condition, because they know, you know, there might actually be some options for lower income tenants. The other thing that I pointed to, or that I've dropped in the chat there, I hope it's of interest to people, is a report that we did at the Tenants Union around eviction earlier this year, but looking at kind of the impact of COVID as a crisis, and then things like bushfires, but also things like floods, how that hits households and communities in a really large way, but also recognizing that prior to COVID, we had these natural disasters, but we also know that individuals all the time have life crises. At some point in my life, I'm going to face a substantial life crisis. And if I am supported through that, then I'm going to recover a whole lot quicker. And there's a whole range of ways that our renting laws really don't support people to stay in their homes. And recovery means having a home. You know, you need that home to rebuild. So we also have a range of recommendations in there around what it would look like to actually build in some protections and frameworks for something when something like this happens, exactly like this, for a community. Actually, anybody who's renting would suddenly have some supports to rely on. So it's not something that people can actively do in a way, but you probably are part of of a conversation. You might be a landlord yourself, and I think thinking through what it would look like to put in place protections. Often when we're raising this, it's not a direct attack on you as a landlord. It's to say, actually, how do we make sure you're not going to do the wrong thing, but how do we make sure that everybody can rely on supports and can rely on a strong framework? So when this happens, they don't have to worry what your reaction might be. They can just go, oh, I have this in place. I feel secure and I can rely on these supports. So I think, starting the conversation, informing yourself and recognizing kind of how useful some of these reforms can be a very valuable thing.
Thank you. I think, yeah, that speaks to that mental health and resilience issues that Jean was speaking to as well. Yes, somebody did ask, sorry, now we're over time. Sorry about that. We will wind up shortly, but I'll just quickly cover the questions that people have asked at this point. Claire has asked, what do we think about the Northern Rivers Reconstruction Corporation and whether it is a way to move things forward?
Well, very quickly in a minute, I think it is necessary and it's a way. It focuses mostly on infrastructures, not on the soft skill, which is still being managed by the other agencies. And I think a critical question that we'll need to answer to resolve both the immediate questions that people ask about how they can clean and rebuild, but also what do they do in the long term, is organizing the buyback of the lands and exchange of the houses of the flood affected people, because a lot of people are unsure now whether should actually invest any grant that they may or may have not received into rebuilding, renovating, cleaning the house, or just leaving it as is and moving elsewhere. And we absolutely need clarity on this, like what are we doing, what is the strategy, and this is lacking. So there's great expectations that the corporation provides us clarity. Will it?
Yes, I think the buyback's a good thing to raise. I was going to raise that as well. Yeah, that's a very important part of the whole picture and a part of the whole national debate around what's happened in our region as well, I'm aware. Zoe Sutton has also asked whether pet ownership, if it creates more complexity for people experiencing housing insecurity and homelessness. I know we've touched on people leaving domestic violence and mothers with children at school, but we haven't actually touched on interspecies families.
Yeah, I can speak a little bit to that. Absolutely. I think, there's a lot of good landlords and real estates out there, but I think absolutely there's a buy, because the rental market's so competitive. And I'll be honest, I've experienced this myself. Like, I recently got a no grounds notice. It was actually a shared household because we wanted to, live in less dwellings overall with people I've known for a long period of time. And a lot of applications were scratched out because we have a cat. And outside of that, great tenants overall. So I've got a bit of personal experience, but I think we do hear a lot of people with pets, and essentially they're members of the family. It's not even a negotiation to rehome them. It's not a question, but it does make it more difficult to find a tenancy. And it's also, it's really hard to establish if you think someone's being mistreated because of that, because of the way it's, they're crossed out for, on no reason, you weren't successful this time, but absolutely, I've got no doubt at all that that's happening. And yeah, I do, we speak to clients, we hear anecdotally that there's people who are in some kind of transitional arrangement or homeless because they're not going to part with their pet, but they just can't find a tenancy. And it's another barrier that just shouldn't be there, because the reality is a lot of pet, and I just don't want to use the word pet ownership. I think they're not possessions, but I think it's more, there's people that are very responsible, very good pet owners. And we talk to clients all the time, they don't have consent to a pet, but we're saying, but you're not actually doing anything wrong. There's no damage, there's no noise, you're very responsible. In fact, you're a fantastic tenant, but are getting pressured to not have their pet there because the landlord's decided they don't like. Again, it's not all landlords, but they're just like, oh, we prefer not to have a dog because, and yeah, it's brutal. But yeah, and I know there's there's some small progress with, in stratas with owners corporations not being able to prevent someone having a pet, but it's a very small step. But often the clients I speak to, it's an emotional conversation because they don't even want to entertain it as an idea, but at the same time they're being told that they can't have a family member in the pet, even though it's not impacting the tenancy at all.
So people are having to choose between housing their whole family or living in a car so that they can have their whole family together. Yeah, incredible. It's just awful, impossible.
I mean, yeah, and I'd argue the flip side, having a pet is part of someone's right to peace and quiet enjoyment in their tenancy, because, you know, the pets have so much more value to someone's life than just, you know, I can't describe it adequately for everyone, but it's just, yeah.
Anne has made a comment about that as well. When you have job, home and neighbourhood, a pet is, when you've lost your job, home and your neighbourhood, a pet is a comfort, familiarity and joy, but it shouldn't be a barrier to renting. Yes. And lots of people are backing that up. And Zoe's doing research on that in South Australia. Yes. Thanks, RB. Are more people sleeping rough with their pets, or are they doing something else?
So look, I don't have numbers, so I couldn't say. I would say intuitively, yes, they are, because I've heard anecdotally a number of stories of people who have been affected by the floods and who have not just pets like dogs and cats, but also like horses and goats, because we live, you know, in rural area too, and who are really struggling because of the health of the animals that they can't adequately cater for. There's been some solidarity among, you know, residents helping each other out, but it is an issue. It's a compounding issue, to be honest, I'd say.
Yes, yes, and I know, yes, there's a homeless person that we see regularly, and she has a lovely companion dog, and that relationship and the meaning of that relationship is completely evident to everybody. So that's a really, really important issue to bring up. Yes, so Zoe and yes, talking about that, and a street vet program in the UK. Wow, that sounds great, Anne. Maybe that's something we should think about as well. I think we should probably wrap up because we've gone quite a long way over time. I didn't realise how far over time. Sorry. Thank you so much for everybody for your patience, and thank you so much for your time to our wonderful, wonderful panellists, Brendan Ross, Simone Hickey, John Lee, John Renouf and Jemima Mowbray. Thank you so much for coming and just sharing more about what's actually happening in our community. I'm just so grateful. And thank you to Taza and Sally and to Roger for putting the session on. Thank you.